was my 35th birthday. 35 years. A number that suddenly felt less like a milestone and more like a marker of time wasted. And on that day, my 35th birthday, he gave me a gift that shattered my life. Not with a bang, not with a spectacular ethereal explosion, but with the quiet, insidious creep of poison, seeping into the very foundations of everything I thought was real. Not a weapon, not a cruel joke delivered with a sneer, but something far more calculated, far more deeply unsettling in its quiet, insidious cruelty. Something wrapped in heavy, impossibly expensive paper, the kind that whispered promises of luxury and whispered lies of devotion, and tied with a bow of perfect, unforgiving satin, just like him. Mark. The name itself now left a bitter taste in my mouth. Mark was always a master of the surface, of crafted appearances, charming to a fault, meticulously attentive to the smallest most insignificant detail, seemingly endlessly, performatively thoughtful. For 10 long, wasted years, he'd painstakingly, deliberately painted this elaborate, glossy picture of the perfect husband, the perfect marriage, the perfect life. And I, blinded by what insidious cocktail of hope, naivete, and a desperate longing for the fairy tale. Like a complete and utter fool, I'd taken that deceptively beautiful canvas, hung it proudly on the most prominent wall of my heart, and declared it my reality. My beautiful, perfect, real life. A masterpiece of illusion, meticulously crafted, expertly maintained, and utterly, devastatingly fake. We met in college, cliché as it sounds. He was everything the brochures promised and more. The golden boy, incarnate. Pre-med, naturally, because anything less ambitious would have been beneath him. Captain of the debate team, silver-tongued and sharp-witted, able to argue black into blinding white and back again before you could even blink. All delivered with that effortless, dazzling charisma that made everyone around him, myself included, most tragically of all, simply gravitate. Drawn in like moths to a carefully constructed, exquisitely deceptive flame. I, on the other hand, in stark, unflattering contrast, was quieter, more reserved, more comfortable in the hushed corners of libraries than bathed in the spotlight of lecture halls, more at ease observing the world unfold from the edges of the room than commanding center stage. Maybe, in retrospect, that fundamental difference, that chasm of personality, is why I was so utterly, irrevocably susceptible to his carefully orchestrated, aggressively dazzling charm. Or maybe more truthfully, more painfully, maybe that's why I missed, or deliberately, willfully ignored, the hairline fractures in his perfect facade for so agonizingly, so catastrophically long. Or perhaps the most brutal, gut-wrenching truth of all, maybe I just fundamentally didn't want to see them, didn't dare to see them, for fear of what the crumbling facade might be beneath. Our relationship, in the cold, harsh light of brutal hindsight, was less a slow, tender burn, and more a meticulously orchestrated wildfire, designed from the outset to consume everything in its path, leaving behind nothing but ashes and smoke. He swept me off my feet with the practiced ease of a seasoned stage magician, pulling rabbits of affection and silk scarves of devotion from thin air, dazzling me with empty promises and hollow pronouncements of eternal love. The whirlwind romance, the whirlwind courtship, the whirlwind, almost aggressively hasty proposal within a year that now, in the rearview mirror of my shattered life, feels less like reality and more like a fever dream. A carefully constructed illusion designed to trap me in its gilded cage. And then the wedding, of course, the inevitable, almost preordained wedding. Picture perfect, flawlessly executed, ripped straight from the glossy, aspirational pages of a bridal magazine, in a beautiful, sun-drenched vineyard, the rolling Tuscan-esque hills, a carefully curated backdrop for our performative perfection. Surrounded by hundreds of smiling friends and beaming family, all of whom, in their well-meaning, utterly clueless naivete, swore with absolute, unwavering certainty that we were meant to be. Soulmates, the perfect match, a fairy tale come true, a lie whispered so often, so convincingly, that even I, the supposed heroine of this tragic romance, began to believe it. The first few years, I'll grant him that, I'll concede this small, almost insignificant point in the grand, devastating scheme of things, they were good, comfortable at least. We built a life, yes, a home, yes, a carefully curated, meticulously maintained routine, brick by painstaking brick, like building a beautiful, impenetrable prison around ourselves, around our slowly suffocating love. But somewhere, almost imperceptibly at first, somewhere in the slow, grinding, relentless passage of time, the vibrant, carefully chosen colors of that deceptively beautiful, deceptively solid canvas began to subtly, then steadily, fade. To leach away, like dye bleeding into water, leaving behind a muted, unsettling, increasingly oppressive gray, a monochrome landscape of broken promises and unspoken resentments. It wasn't anything overtly, demonstrably dramatic. Not initially, of course. That kind of blatant, obvious betrayal would have been too easy to recognize, too simple to confront, too straightforward to escape. No, Mark was far too subtle, far too cunning for such clumsy, amateurish tactics. Instead, it was just subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in the atmosphere of our home, in the delicate, increasingly strained dynamic of our marriage. Tiny tremors beneath the surface, hairline cracks in the foundation, subtle, almost silent warnings before the earth finally, irrevocably, began to split apart. He started working what he called increasingly demanding hours, that tired, worn-out lawyer's cliche, I know now, the go-to excuse for 1,000 adulterous husbands across the world, coming home later and later each night, perpetually, dramatically exhausted, perpetually, performatively stressed, perpetually, heartbreakingly, absent. Absent from our shared life, absent from our bed, absent from my heart. Our once lively, meandering conversations, the kind that used to stretch lazily late into the night, fueled by stolen kisses, cheap wine, and whispered dreams of a shared future, became shallower, more perfunctory, more clipped, more transactional. Reduced to functional exchanges of information, logistical arrangements disguised as intimacy. How was your day? I'd ask, genuinely yearning to connect, desperate to bridge the ever-widening, terrifying chasm that was slowly, inexorably growing between us, threatening to swallow us whole. Fine, he'd reply, his voice flat, devoid of any discernible inflection, his eyes already drifting away, focusing on something, anything, other than me. Anything interesting happen? Nope. And then with a sigh so heavy, so theatrical, so utterly manufactured that it spoke volumes of his carefully cultivated weariness, he'd retreat. Physically, emotionally, mentally. Bury himself in his work, the cold, sterile glow of his laptop screen reflecting in his increasingly distant eyes, or lose himself in the mindless, numbing drone of the television, flipping channels with restless, agitated fingers, searching for something, anything, to distract him from the unbearable weight of what? Of me? Of our life together? Or, well, at the time, lost in the fog of denial and desperate hope, I genuinely didn't know what else. I only started to piece together the horrifying, devastatingly simple truth much, much later. Far too late to salvage anything but the shattered fragments of my own self-respect. I tried, of course, like a drowning woman frantically grasping at phantom lifelines, flailing in the unforgiving waves. God, how pathetically, desperately I tried. Desperate to salvage something, anything, from the slow-motion wreckage of what we were inexorably becoming. I planned elaborate, meticulously researched, painstakingly executed, romantic date nights, candlelight dinners for two served on our finest china, whispered promises of rekindled passion under the vast and different expanse of the star-strewn night sky. I suggested spontaneous, last-minute weekend getaways to cozy, secluded cabins, nestled deep in the snow-dusted mountains, conjuring images of roaring fireplaces, steaming mugs of cocoa, and stolen kisses in the crisp winter air, desperately hoping to recapture even a fleeting echo of the lost intimacy we'd once shared, the incandescent spark that had once burned so brightly, so fiercely between us, now reduced to nothing more than a faint, pathetic, dying ember. I even, in a moment of truly pathetic, almost tragically comical desperation, bought new lingerie. Expensive, ridiculously impractical, utterly pointless lace and silk confections that felt utterly foreign, utterly wrong against my increasingly numb skin, like dressing up in a costume for a role I no longer understood, for an audience that had long since lost interest, for a play that had already, irrevocably, closed. I was desperate to reignite that dying flame, that irretrievably lost connection, that phantom echo, that ghost of a memory of what we used to be. But it was like talking to a brick wall, like shouting into the deafening void of space, like pouring precious life-giving water into a bottomless, endlessly thirsty sieve. He'd go through the motions. Yes, I'll give him that much. He'd dutifully show up for the date nights, his eyes glazed over with boredom. He'd grudgingly pack a suitcase for the weekend trips, his sighs heavy with thinly veiled resentment. He'd even offer a cursory, almost pitying glance at the ridiculous lingerie, a flicker of something that might have been construed as appreciation by a more optimistic, more delusional woman, but which I recognized with a sickening lurch of my stomach for what it truly was, polite, condescending boredom. But his eyes, those once bright, once loving eyes, were always distant, unfocused, perpetually lost somewhere else, in some other reality, some other life, some other woman's arms that didn't pointedly, deliberately, cruelly include me. His touch became perfunctory, mechanical, almost clinical, a quick, dismissive brush of dry lips against my forehead, a fleeting, meaningless pat on my arm, devoid of warmth, devoid of genuine intention, devoid of any recognizable trace of love. I felt myself fading, slowly, agonizingly, relentlessly, becoming less and less substantial with each passing day, becoming invisible in my own marriage, in my own home, in my own life. Like a ghost haunting the dusty, forgotten corners of a life I no longer recognized as my own. A life that had been so carefully, so expertly stolen from me, piece by agonizing piece, by the man I had vowed to spend forever with. My birthday. Oh God, my birthday. My 35th birthday. It should have been a celebration, a joyful marker of another year of life, of love, of shared history. My birthday was always a significant, almost sacred occasion for me. Not for the presents, no, never truly for the material things, not even for the obligatory, often forced cake and increasingly hollow cheer, but for that deeply human, profoundly validating, achingly precious feeling of being truly, completely seen, of being acknowledged, not just as a fixture in his life, not just as a convenient accessory to his carefully curated existence, but as a real, breathing, feeling human being, of being celebrated, not just for passively existing in his orbit, but for actively, vibrantly, imperfectly being me. And Mark, the master of performative affection, he, to his credit, usually reliably delivered. Lavish, often ridiculously extravagant gifts, carefully chosen, meticulously wrapped, designed to impress more than to truly touch my heart. Surprise parties, elaborate, over-the-top productions, meticulously planned down to the last, utterly insignificant detail, orchestrated with military precision and executed with a theatrical flourish. Grand, sweeping gestures designed to overwhelm, to impress, to distract, to compensate, to mask the ever-growing void beneath the surface, perhaps. It was all, in the end, just another carefully rehearsed, flawlessly delivered performance, part and parcel of his meticulously constructed, perfect husband persona. I realize now, a hollow, empty performance staged not for me, not for our shared life, but for an audience of one, himself. A desperate, pathetic attempt to convince himself, more than anyone else, that he was still capable of love, of devotion, of basic human decency. This year, on that fateful, world-altering 35th birthday morning, he presented me with a small, exquisitely wrapped box at breakfast. The paper was a heavy, luxuriously textured cream, almost offensively expensive to the touch, embossed with delicate, swirling silver patterns that seemed to mock my own fading dreams. The bow, a perfect, almost aggressively symmetrical, hand-tied loop of dove gray satin, cool and smooth beneath my fingertips, just like his perpetually cool, perpetually smooth demeanor. "Happy birthday, darling," he said, his voice a low, practiced murmur, smooth as silk, almost too perfect, almost too rehearsed, with that familiar, unsettlingly, achingly practiced smile that didn't ever anymore reach his eyes. Those once warm, once loving eyes, now cold, distant, and utterly, irrevocably empty. Inside, nestled on a bed of impossibly rich, impossibly dark velvet, the color of dried blood, was a delicate silver locket. Heart-shaped, of course, because what else would it be? What other shape could possibly convey the saccharine, hollow sentimentality he was so desperately trying to project? Beautiful, undeniably so, in a cold, almost sterile, manufactured sort of way. The kind of beauty you see in department store windows, perfectly polished, meticulously arranged, utterly, fundamentally soulless. Like a diamond, flawlessly cut, brilliantly sparkling, but devoid of any warmth, any life, any genuine value. "Oh, Mark, it's lovely," I managed to choke out, my voice sounding strained, thin, almost threadbare, even to my own ears, forcing a smile that felt brittle and fragile, like ancient glass, like it might shatter into a million irreparable pieces at the slightest pressure. And it was, objectively speaking, I suppose, pretty. Expensive looking, certainly, radiating an aura of manufactured wealth and hollow luxury, but cold. Profoundly, disturbingly, unsettlingly cold, to the touch, to the eye, to the soul. Somehow, deeply, intrinsically impersonal. Like he'd picked it out in a rushed, panicked frenzy, grabbed the first heart-shaped, silver-colored thing he could find, just to hurriedly tick a box on his ever-present, ever-demanding perfect husband checklist. Another task completed, another performance flawlessly executed. He beamed, that practiced, utterly empty smile widening, radiating a false, manufactured warmth that did absolutely nothing to thaw the growing glacier of ice that was steadily forming in my stomach, solidifying around my heart, threatening to freeze me from the inside out. Pleased with himself, utterly convinced he'd nailed the performance, delivered the perfect line, played his role to absolute chilling perfection. "Open it," he urged, gesturing towards the locket with a practiced, almost theatrical flourish of his hand. I hesitated. My fingers, suddenly clumsy, unresponsive, and ice-cold, hovered over the silver clasp, reluctant to obey his command, reluctant to unleash whatever darkness I instinctively knew lay hidden within that deceptively beautiful box. There was just something profoundly off about it, an almost visceral unease, a prickling sensation that crawled up my spine and settled like ice at the base of my neck, a silent alarm bell ringing insistently, desperately in the deepest recesses of my intuition, screaming at me to turn away, to close the box, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, to retreat back into the comforting, albeit increasingly threadbare illusion of my perfect life. But something else, a darker, more insistent curiosity, a desperate, almost self-destructive need for the truth, no matter how agonizing, no matter how devastating, propelled me forward. And I opened it anyway, clicked open the tiny, intricate clasp, the sound sharp and brittle in the oppressive silence of our picture-perfect kitchen. Lifted the delicate, heart-shaped silver lid, my breath held captive in my lungs, my heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. Inside, nestled on a bed of rich, dark velvet side by side, were two tiny photos, miniature portraits, perfectly precisely fitted within the heart-shaped frame. And that, in that single, agonizing, eternity-stretching moment, was when my carefully constructed, painstakingly maintained world finally, irrevocably tilted on its precarious axis. When the foundations, built on sand and whispered lies, crumbled silently, catastrophically beneath my feet. When the pastel-painted lie of my perfect marriage, my perfect husband, my perfect life, shattered into a million irreparable fragments, leaving behind nothing but jagged edges and the bitter, acrid taste of ash in my mouth. One photo, to his twisted credit, was, unbelievably, of me. A flattering picture, I'll grant him that small, meaningless concession. A carefully chosen, professionally enhanced image from our sun-drenched, laugh-filled vacation to Italy last year. Smiling, genuinely, heartbreakingly carefree, bathed in the warm, golden light of the Tuscan sun. The me he supposedly, performatively loved, the me he claimed to cherish with every fiber of his being, the me he'd sworn, with those honeyed, deceptive words, to spend forever and always with. The woman he'd promised to protect, to honor, to love, until death, and apparently well beyond do us part. The other was a woman I had never in my entire life consciously, knowingly seen before. Blonde. Strikingly, almost aggressively blonde, the kind that screams salon highlights and expensive, time-consuming maintenance. Big, unnervingly bright blue eyes, the unsettlingly artificial color of glacial ice, wide and unnervingly, almost aggressively innocent. And a smile. A wide, dazzling, practiced smile, perfectly white teeth gleaming plastered across her flawlessly made-up face, laughing, radiant in that almost aggressively cheerful, utterly manufactured way, like a toothpaste commercial come to life. And disturbingly, unsettlingly familiar. Vaguely, like a half-forgotten melody, like a phantom limb, like a half-recalled line from a long-lost poem, like a ghost from a deeply buried, half-forgotten dream. Or more accurately, with a sickening lurch of my stomach, a nightmare. I stared at the locket, my eyes locked, transfixed, almost hypnotized by that smiling blonde stranger, then slowly, mechanically, agonizingly, lifted my gaze to Mark, my voice barely a strained, disbelieving whisper, the sound thin and reedy like a dying breath. Who is this, Mark? He blinked, those cold, empty eyes flickering almost imperceptibly, that practiced, charming smile faltering, cracking minutely for just the barest, most fleeting fraction of a second. A hairline fracture in the perfect, impenetrable facade, a momentary glimpse behind the carefully constructed mask. Then, with almost sickening, nauseating speed, that practiced charm, that carefully cultivated persona, clicked back into place, snapping shut like a steel trap, locking down any hint of vulnerability, any flicker of guilt, any trace of humanity. Oh, honey, don't be silly, Sarah. Don't be ridiculous. That's just a model, sweetheart, for the locket. You know, they put stock photos in them for display purposes, darling, before you put your own pictures in. You know, the real pictures, the ones that are supposed to go there, the ones of us. Stock photos, Sarah, he repeated, his voice dripping with patronizing sweetness, fake concern, and a subtle, almost imperceptible undercurrent of barely concealed contempt. Come on, Sarah, please, you're being so dramatic, darling, please. Dramatic? Dramatic? Was he actually serious? Was he truly, honestly in that moment, standing there, in our once happy kitchen, looking me directly in the eye and expecting me to swallow that pathetic, insultingly transparent lie? I was holding a silver locket, a supposed birthday gift from my husband, my supposed soulmate of 10 agonizing wasted years, with a photo of another woman, a complete and utter stranger, nestled smugly, possessively beside my own carefully chosen, deceptively cheerful picture. And I, the betrayed, the heartbroken, the one whose entire reality had just imploded around her ears, I was being dramatic? The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the statement, the utter soul-crushing contempt it revealed, was almost as devastating as the betrayal itself. He really, truly, honestly thought I was that stupid, that blind, that utterly, pathetically, desperately compliant. I jabbed at the blonde woman's photo with a trembling finger, my hand shaking so violently now I could barely keep the delicate locket steady, the silver surface slick with the sudden sheen of cold sweat on my palm. Mark, I said again, my voice now sharper, harder, rising, cracking under the weight of suppressed fury. This isn't just any stock photo, Mark. Don't insult my intelligence, Mark. Don't insult me. Really look at her, Mark. Really look at this picture. She looks familiar, disturbingly, unsettlingly familiar. Like I've seen her before. Somewhere. Recently. I know I have, Mark. I know it. He sighed again, even heavier this time, even more theatrical, even more dripping with false exasperation. The long-suffering, perpetually misunderstood husband, patiently, condescendingly, infuriatingly dealing with his irrational, hysterical, overly emotional wife. Sarah, he said, turning away from me once more, retreating back into his carefully constructed fortress of denial, busying himself with the mundane, utterly pointless, almost ritualistic task of stirring yet more sugar into his already ridiculously, offensively sweet coffee cup. Sarah, please, darling, please just let it go, okay? You're imagining things. You're letting your anxiety get the better of you, sweetheart. You haven't. I promise you on my life, Sarah, you haven't. It's just a pretty blonde woman, a generic face. They use these generic headshots in jewelry displays all the time. It's nothing, Sarah. I swear to you, darling. Literally nothing. Don't make something out of nothing, sweetheart. Please. Just trust me on this, okay? Just trust me. But I couldn't shake it. That icy, visceral certainty, that cold, hard knot of dread that had burrowed deep beneath my skin, settling like a malignant tumor in the pit of my stomach. that chilling, insistent, nagging feeling of recognition, like a half-formed memory struggling to surface, to break free from the suffocating chains of denial. That bone-deep, gut-wrenching certainty, cold and unwavering as steel, that something was profoundly, irrevocably, terrifyingly wrong. That the lie he was so desperately trying to sell me, the carefully constructed illusion he was so frantically trying to maintain, was about to shatter into a million sharp, unforgiving pieces, cutting me to the bone, leaving me bleeding and broken in the wreckage of our once perfect, once beautiful, once blissfully, tragically, falsely happy life. I want to know who she is, Mark, I repeated, my voice now utterly devoid of emotion, flat, cold, and hard as ice, the tremor of fear and confusion now replaced by a glacial, unyielding resolve. Really, Mark, I need to know. Who is she? He finally, thank God, dropped the charade. Let the carefully constructed, meticulously maintained facade crumble and fall away, revealing for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the cold, ugly, terrifying truth beneath. The practiced smile, the condescending patience, the faux charming, utterly deceptive persona, all of it fractured, cracked, dissolved into thin, acrid air, revealing the raw, ugly, terrifying reality beneath, replaced by a raw, visceral, almost animalistic flicker of pure, unadulterated annoyance. Why? He snapped, finally turning to face me, his eyes now narrowed, cold, hard, utterly devoid of any trace of warmth, any flicker of humanity. Why are you making such a monumental, such an unnecessary big deal out of this, Sarah? It's a gift, for God's sake, Sarah, a birthday gift. Can't you just accept it for once? Can't you just appreciate it? For once in your life, Sarah, just be grateful. Appreciate what, Mark? I shot back, my voice now rising, sharp and cutting, fueled by a burning, righteous anger that finally, blessedly, began to burn through the suffocating fog of fear and confusion, clearing the way for clarity, for truth, for the cold, hard, unforgiving reality. Appreciate what exactly, Mark? A silver locket, heart-shaped and oh so romantically meaningless, with a complete and utter stranger's face grinning up at me from inside? On my birthday, Mark? Our 10th wedding anniversary just last month? What kind of message, Mark, in God's name, are you deliberately, sadistically, intentionally, cruelly trying to send to me? Because trust me, Mark, message received, loud and clear. He turned away again for the final time, thank God, in that agonizing, life-altering conversation, retreating even further back into his self-constructed fortress of denial, busying himself with the mundane, utterly pointless, almost ritualistic task of rinsing his already empty coffee cup in the sink, scrubbing at it with unnecessary force, as if he could somehow scrub away the truth, scrub away the betrayal, scrub away the stain of his own deceit. You're reading way too much into it, Sarah, he muttered, his voice muffled now by the sound of the running water, dismissive, condescending, utterly, unforgivably detached to the bitter, bitter end. It's just a locket. For God's sake, Sarah, it's just a goddamn locket. But I wasn't. No. For the first time in our 10-year charade of a marriage, I knew with absolute, unwavering, bone-deep certainty that I wasn't. I wasn't being dramatic. I wasn't being irrational. I wasn't, as he so often, so dismissively accused, reading too much into it. I was finally, agonizingly, terrifyingly, heartbreakingly awake. And that's when, with sickening, nauseating, soul-crushing clarity, the little pieces, the seemingly insignificant fragments of doubt, of unease, of nagging suspicion that I'd been so diligently, so desperately, so willfully ignoring for months, for years, started to click into place, sliding together with horrifying, devastating precision, forming a complete, terrifyingly coherent, utterly damning picture. The late nights at work, stretching later and later, becoming more and more frequent, more and more blatant in their implausibility. The distant, unfocused eyes staring vacantly through me, not at me, seeing someone, something, somewhere else entirely. The perfunctory, almost robotic kisses delivered like cold, contractual obligations, not as warm, spontaneous expressions of genuine affection. The way he'd flinch, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably, every single time I'd accidentally brush against his phone or reach for it, innocently, to check the time, as if my touch alone could somehow contaminate his precious secrets, expose his carefully guarded lies. The unfamiliar, unsettlingly seductive, aggressively floral scent of a different perfume I'd occasionally, fleetingly catch on his clothes, a lingering, ghost-like fragrance that clung to his shirts, to his jackets, to his very skin, a scent that was undeniably, definitively not mine, a scent that he'd always dismiss with a wave of his hand, a shrug of his shoulders, and a casual, utterly unbelievable, insultingly transparent, "Oh, that must just be the dry cleaner, honey. You know how they are with those chemicals. Lingers for days, doesn't it?" Annoying, really. The unfamiliar, unsettlingly seductive, aggressively floral scent of a different perfume I'd occasionally, fleetingly catch on his clothes, a lingering, ghost-like fragrance that clung to his shirts, to his jackets, to his very skin, a scent that was undeniably, definitively not mine, a scent that he'd always dismiss with a wave of his hand, a shrug of his shoulders, and a casual, utterly unbelievable, insultingly transparent, "Oh, that must just be the dry cleaner, honey. You know how they are with those chemicals. Lingers for days, doesn't it?" Annoying, really. And the locket, that heart-shaped silver locket, the gift, the birthday surprise. It wasn't a gift at all, of course, not to me. It was a taunt, a deliberate, calculated, ice-cold, deeply personal taunt, a cruel, almost sadistic joke disguised as affection. He'd given me a locket. Yes, but not just any locket. He'd given me a locket with his lover's picture nestled inside, grinning up at me, mocking me, taunting me with her youthful radiance, her blatant, undeniable otherness, right next to mine. My own carefully curated, deceptively cheerful, increasingly hollow image of wifely perfection. Side by side, just like they were in the locket, like he was deliberately, consciously mocking me, daring me to notice, daring me to question, testing the very limits of my blindness, my naivety, my pathetic, unwavering, utterly undeserved loyalty, testing how much humiliation, how much blatant disrespect, how much soul-crushing betrayal I was willing to silently, passively endure. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it, it was breathtaking, truly, breathtakingly, appallingly cruel. To cheat, to lie, to betray the most sacred vows, the most fundamental promises, that's one thing. Horrible, devastating beyond words, gut-wrenchingly painful, but understandable, in a twisted, deeply flawed, fundamentally broken human way. People make terrible, unforgivable mistakes. They succumb to temptation. They lose their way in the labyrinth of their own desires, their own weaknesses, their own brokenness. But this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment, a fleeting indiscretion fueled by alcohol and opportunity. This was cold, calculated, deliberate. This was premeditated. This was psychological warfare, pure and simple. He wasn't just having a tawdry, pathetic little affair with some office bimbo. He was playing a sick, twisted, deeply damaging game. And I, his wife, his supposed partner, his supposed soulmate, I was nothing more than the pawn. The unwitting, utterly expendable pawn in his cruel, narcissistic game. That night, when he finally, inevitably, predictably came home, all practiced smiles and hollow, utterly fake concern, asking about my birthday, about my day, about the lovely gift, I was ready for him. Completely, utterly, terrifyingly ready. I didn't scream, I didn't yell, I didn't throw anything. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a single tear, a single tremor of fear, a single crack in my newly forged armor of ice-cold resolve. I just showed him the photos, one by one, methodically, deliberately laying them out on the cold, unforgiving kitchen counter between us. The locket, still clutched tightly in my hand, the silver cold and sharp against my skin, the framed photo, his secret, shameful trophy clutched in the other, side by side, just like they were in the locket. "Happy birthday to me, Mark," I said, my voice steady, finally free of the tremor of fear and confusion, now laced with a chilling, almost detached sarcasm. "Thanks for the gift, it's revealing." He tried to lie, of course. What else could he do? More flimsy, utterly pathetic denials, more transparent, insultingly unbelievable excuses. But I was done, completely, irrevocably done. Done with the endless, soul-crushing lies, done with the manipulative, emotionally abusive games, done finally, blessedly with him. "I want you out, Mark," I said, my voice still steady, still quiet, but now edged with a sharp, diamond-hard finality. "Out of this house, out of my life. It's over, Mark, completely, irrevocably over." He was shocked, truly, genuinely shocked. The surprise in his eyes was almost comical if the situation weren't so devastatingly tragic. He'd expected tears, maybe. Volcanic anger, definitely. A dramatic, explosive confrontation, undoubtedly. But not this. This cold, quiet, utterly unyielding finality. This calm, almost detached pronouncement of the end. He'd underestimated me, utterly and completely. He'd underestimated the breaking point. He'd fatally underestimated the quiet, unassuming woman he'd spent 10 long, wasted years slowly, deliberately, systematically destroying. My 35th birthday. The day he gave me a gift that shattered my life. But also the day he inadvertently, unknowingly, blessedly, gave me something else, something infinitely more valuable, something I would never ever trade for all the pastel-painted lies and hollow promises in the world. The truth, the brutal, agonizing, liberating truth. The freedom, the unexpected, exhilarating, terrifying freedom to finally, truly start living a real life. A life without carefully constructed illusions and soul-crushing deceptions. A life entirely, unapologetically, gloriously of my own. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals are also, paradoxically, the greatest awakenings. And sometimes the cruelest gifts, the ones designed to inflict the deepest pain, are also miraculously the very gifts that finally, irrevocably, set you free.